I worked in, I've worked off and on for about 15 years in an archive in Moscow, the former Communist Party archive, for my own studies. And what you find in there, I mean, it's horrifying, some of the material, because I've been working on the terror era. It's just not something you want to do and then go home and have a family dinner. It's people begging for their lives, people being tortured in their cells, writing letters to Stalin, explaining how they've been beaten, and Stalin writing on them, liar, scumbag, shoot. And you go home at night and it's hard to make the transition. But the degree of clearly falsified documents, falsified by NKVD, KGB officers themselves, in order to protect themselves from their own bosses, to make it seem that they've been very successful. I could tell you one story, I won't, but it affected a friend of mine. It was horrible. But this guy went to visit her and then wrote a false report about her, what she had said to him. And it went into an archive, and then some crazy American historian found it and wrote it up as truth. In a normal world, it'd be called slander and libel.
But the history of archives are filled with similar things.
That's why you have to, and I'm not an expert on archive documents. I'm not. I just went looking for something I needed. But you really want people who are trained archivists, who know the provenance of a document, where it came from, how it ended up in that archive. Is there another document somewhere in the vicinity of this archive that contradicts it or supports it? It's a bad business, because anything from a denunciation to an authentic document can end up in an archive, and you simply have to know which is which. And when it comes to these people who 50 years later are hunting Russian spies among American lefties, not only do they not know how to do that, they're not interested in how you do it. And as a historian, that makes me feel very uncomfortable.
We have time for 2 more questions.
Yeah. One day in the summer of 1994, I was returning from St. Sergius Monastery by train to Moscow. We got to the train station in Moscow, and when we got out, and I was with a Russian companion, we noticed some people who were being roughed up, I mean rather violently. Turned out this was Patriots' Day. And it turned out that I was later told, and we saw something of this on TV, that, well, Patriots' Day, what do? You beat up people from the Caucasian, Caucasus. This is an interesting attitude, and it was not seen as anything exceptional at all. What I'm wondering about is, how do these attitudes really impact on what goes on today, and should this whole situation impact on our relationship with the Russian government?
I'm not an entirely objective interpreter of what you saw. The reality is there's a tremendous amount of racism in Russia directed at people of color. Their people of color tend to be people from the Caucasus, whom Russians believe are thieves and terrorists. Russia has a skinhead movement, a neo-fascist movement, and one of their political sports is finding these people defenseless on the streets and beating them so badly that they sometimes kill them. Occasionally they've mistaken an American black person for somebody from the Caucasus and done that, and it's been international episodes. They've beaten African diplomats. It's a bad and growing problem in Russia. Racism everywhere grows out of pain, out of history. I, however, am a little slower. I mean, I condemn it and I judge it, but I context it because I grew up in a completely segregated town in the South. My whole upbringing until I was 16 was whites there, coloreds there. I saw the Klan, which had a float on the 4th of July. Really quite a spectacular float. They had a lot of money. And I saw the guys in the back of their pickup trucks. So this is something Russia has to deal with. It can't affect our relationship with Russia any more than the world based its foreign policy on our racial our apartheid, which is what we had in America. It's particularly dangerous in a nuclear country because the idea of a destabilized nuclear country, and this kind of stuff can destabilize a country, is simply too frightful to consider. Medvedev in particular seems to be alarmed by it and has undertaken a campaign. But do we know how you end it? I mean, you outlive it is the answer. That's how you do it. You outlive it and you find reform and wise leaders. We were very slow. The terrorism in Russia hasn't helped, of course. So what you saw is something that happens a lot.
Steve is right about how the economic pain has led to a resurgence of neo-Nazi groups, for example, racist groups. But there are within Russia, there is the political space for Russian human rights groups to combat racism, to combat neo-Nazism. Now, one of the freelance journalists whose specialty, whose beat was neo-Nazism, was gunned down on a street in January with a human rights lawyer. But I do think, as The Nation wrote many years ago, during an earlier phase of the Cold War, the great British historian E.P. Thompson, trying to break through the governmental official Cold War of both sides, the U.S. and Russia, that citizens can find ways to support the work of those in other countries. It doesn't need to be governments. And I do think President Obama has been wise and careful in stepping back from this aggressive democracy promotion that the United States has tried to export in these last years, and has spoken, particularly when it came to Iran and to a certain extent in Russia when he spoke in Moscow, about how important it is for human rights to come from below, for citizens of their own countries to support people in their own countries. Yet there is a solidarity, a transnational solidarity that I don't think we should ignore, and that isn't imposition of one's own or different culture. It's just supporting universal human rights in different countries and yet engaging while doing so, even while these brutalities are going on. And the newspaper, which The Nation has supported in different ways through advertising as it has supported us. We both need support. The Russian newspaper Novaya Gazeta has been at the forefront of another thing you need in combating racism, neo-Nazism, is the reporting, the exposing, the documenting of these abuses so people can learn about what is happening in their own societies. And I think one myth in this country is that the press is totally shut down. State television is for the most part controlled, but I would argue, and it's a longer conversation, that the Russian press is livelier on any given day in Moscow than it is in New York City. There's a wider range of views. Now, of course, if you factor in magazines like The Nation and factor in magazines, it's different, but their newspaper culture is a more spirited one.
What effect do you think America's dread of communism has affected our foreign policy towards them?
Over the years or today?
Both.
I think we can both comment on that.
Yeah.
You want to go first or shall I go first?
No, you go.
All right, we're going to both comment on that without knowing what the other's going to say. By the way, you've probably picked up the undertones of our dinner table disagreements. Katrina is a profound believer in ordinary people, and I'm older. In the end, unless we're talking about extraordinary circumstances, and maybe it's too bad political systems turned out this way, but it's leaders and elites who have the power, for better or worse. We can pressure them, but in the end, you just about got to break their kneecaps to get them to pay attention, in all countries. Russians are very democratic. I mean, I cringe when I hear people say Russia doesn't know how to do democracy. Michael McFaul tells us, so we got to go there and teach them. No, we don't. Katrina and I were there in 1988, 89, when Gorbachev said, okay, let there be competitive elections.